The cold doesn't care who you are. It just takes what it wants. Michael Johnson thought as he staggered through the snow, his boots crunching over the frozen landscape. The wind howled around him, biting into his exposed face, as if the planet itself was trying to push him back. He should have been with his team, but the battle had scattered them, and now he was alone. His equipment was damaged, and his radio was silent. All he could do was keep moving forward, praying for a miracle. His mind raced through the days of fighting that had led to this moment. The Zinthra, alien invaders, had taken everything from them. Friends, allies, the last semblance of peace on this cursed planet. He knew the risks when he joined the fight, but nothing had prepared him for this. The endless freezing nights, the constant threat of ambush, and the strange, unpredictable behavior of the enemy. Yet there was still something inside him that refused to give up. As the sky grew darker, Michael noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A flash of movement against the white snow. He froze, instinctively reaching for his rifle, but then stopped. It wasn't an enemy soldier, it was a figure, a woman, an alien woman. His heart pounded as he approached cautiously. There, lying in the snow, was Zarakala, a Zinthra warrior. Her body was bruised and broken, 2 stumps where her legs used to be. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her eyes flickering open only to find him standing over her. Zarakala, the warrior queen of her people, was left behind on the battlefield, discarded like an unwanted weapon. Michael couldn't believe it. The fierceness that had once defined her was now replaced with desperation. It would have been easy to walk away, to leave her there to die. After all, she was the enemy. But something in his gut told him that this wasn't the end of the story. He could have left. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. His training, his humanity, whatever it was, it kept him rooted to the spot. He kneeled down beside her, checking her wounds, his breath coming out in mist as he tried to keep his mind focused. "I'm not going to leave you here," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. She gave him a look, eyes narrowed, full of suspicion. Why? Her voice was weak, but it held the defiance of a warrior who had faced death 100 times. "You're not my enemy," Michael said, even as he knew the words might not be enough to bridge the divide between their worlds. But it didn't matter. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. Michael pulled her into his arms, using every ounce of strength to carry her. The storm raged on, but he had one goal now. Keep her alive, get her to shelter. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him for saving her life, but he didn't care. The snow, the wind, the enemy, it all faded as he focused on the woman in his arms, the warrior who, in a twisted way, had become his responsibility. The world around him seemed so vast, so cruel, but there was still something worth fighting for. Humanity's unyielding spirit, the kind that refused to turn its back, even on its enemies. Michael's breath came in short, controlled bursts as he trudged through the deep snow. Zarakala, still unconscious in his arms, was a dead weight that he struggled to keep from slipping from his grip. Every step felt like it could be his last. His boots sank deep into the frozen earth, and the wind howled, carrying the bitter sting of ice. The storm was intensifying, but he had no choice but to push forward. The enemy could be tracking him. He knew the odds of survival were slim, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. His fingers ached from the cold, but the heat from Zarakala's body pressed against him gave him some warmth. She was a fierce warrior, once a queen of her people, and here she was, helpless, relying on him for survival. Michael's mind raced as he continued to move, each step heavier than the last. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest, and in the back of his mind, the nagging thought that he was doing the impossible crept in. Why save her? Why risk his life for someone who had been his enemy just hours ago? Yet, as he glanced down at her, the answer became clear. No matter who she was or what side she fought for, she was still a living being, and she didn't deserve to die alone. In the snow, he had promised himself long ago that he would never abandon anyone, even in the most hopeless of situations. That promise was all he had left. With each step, the weight of their situation settled deeper into his bones, but he pushed through. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted a small cave formation ahead, its entrance barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. The shelter could be their only chance of survival. He gritted his teeth and made his way toward it, the promise of warmth and safety just within reach. Inside the cave, the temperature was slightly better, but not by much. It was still freezing, and the harsh winds outside made it seem like the storm was never ending. Michael carefully laid Zarikala down on a patch of dry snow in the back of the cave. He removed his helmet to let the air cool his face, his sweat freezing on his skin as soon as it hit the open air. His hands shook from both the cold and the exhaustion, but he worked quickly to remove his coat and cover Zarikala with it. He didn't know how long the storm would last, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. The storm would eventually pass, but there was no guarantee they would be alive when it did. Michael sat down next to her, his back resting against the cold stone wall of the cave. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting his mind wander. In the silence, all he could hear was the occasional sound of the wind outside and Zarikala's shallow breaths. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, he had been fighting against her, trying to protect humanity from the threat her people posed. Now, here he was, a soldier, watching over an enemy warrior who had become something more than that. A strange thought crossed his mind. She wasn't just a warrior. She was someone who had known pain, loss, and survival, just like him. In the stillness, Michael couldn't help but wonder what had led Zarikala to this point. What was it like for someone like her, a queen, to be reduced to this? What had she been fighting for? He had no answers, but it didn't matter. What mattered now was that she was alive, and for some reason, that felt like a victory. His eyes flickered to the snow-covered entrance of the cave. The storm outside still raged, but at least, for now, they were safe. Safe enough to catch their breath and live to see another day. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to leave Zarikala to die, not when he still had the strength to fight. The thought of the enemy, of the war, seemed distant now. There was only the present, and the strange bond that was beginning to form between two warriors from opposite worlds. The cave was quiet now, the howling wind from outside muffled by the thick walls of stone. Michael sat against the cold rock, his eyes occasionally flickering to Zarikala. She hadn't moved much since he brought her in, but the steady rise and fall of her chest gave him hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He'd never thought he'd find himself in a situation like this. He'd spent his whole life fighting for his country, for humanity, for the safety of those he cared about. But now, sitting here with an alien warrior who had once been his enemy, he found himself questioning everything. His mind wandered back to the day he first joined the military. He had been young, eager, filled with the desire to prove himself. But over the years, that eagerness had been replaced with a grim understanding of what war truly meant. It wasn't about victory or glory. It was about survival. And in that regard, the lines between friend and foe often blurred. He glanced down at Zarikala, her body still wrapped in the warmth of his coat. Despite everything, despite the years of fighting between their species, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. She was just another soldier, just another person trying to survive. Just like him. The thought was unsettling, but it was the truth. It was strange, though. Before all of this, Michael had never thought much about the Zenthra. They had been the enemy, and that was all he needed to know. But now, as he looked at Zarikala, something inside him had shifted. He knew she wasn't just a mindless warrior. She had depth, history, a purpose. He had seen it in the way she carried herself when she was still on her feet, in the way she fought with an intensity that bordered on the personal. And now, in the stillness of the cave, he could see the vulnerability beneath that warrior facade. Zarikala wasn't just a soldier. She was a person, with dreams, fears, and desires just like any human. She had a past, a future, a story that he would never fully understand. And yet, here they were, both trapped by circumstances, fighting for their survival in a hostile world. The question lingered in his mind. Could they ever truly trust each other? Could he trust her? He glanced back at her again. She was stirring now, her eyes flickering open, though her gaze was unfocused, distant. "You're awake," Michael said softly, not wanting to startle her. She blinked, her eyes slowly focusing on him. But there was no recognition at first. She didn't speak immediately, just stared at him with a mixture of confusion and wariness. He could tell that she was trying to process everything. What had happened, why she was here, and most importantly, why he had decided to save her. Why? she asked, her voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Michael sighed, not sure how to answer. He had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times since he made the decision to help her. But the truth was, he didn't have a good answer. I couldn't leave you, he said simply. She regarded him silently for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger or hatred. It was uncertainty, maybe even a hint of gratitude. The air in the cave was thick with tension, yet there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared sense of being trapped in a situation neither had chosen. Michael reached into his bag and pulled out some water, offering it to her. Zarakala hesitated, her pride clearly fighting against her need. But eventually, she accepted, her hand trembling slightly as she took the bottle. As she drank, Michael couldn't help but watch her, wondering what thoughts were racing through her mind. They were both soldiers, but their worlds were so different. Still, they were here now, together, and that had to count for something. Thank you, Zarakala said, her voice steadier now, though it still held the weight of the pain she had endured. Michael nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared between two people who had nothing left to say, but understood each other in ways that words couldn't explain. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, there was a rare moment of peace. Michael sat back, keeping an eye on Zarakala, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time since he had been sent to this war-torn planet, he didn't feel so alone. They were survivors, both of them, and that was enough for now. The storm outside had slowed to a dull roar, the winds no longer howling as fiercely as before. Inside the cave, the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the soft crackling of a small fire Michael had managed to start. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the edge off the cold. Zarakala had drifted back into a light sleep, her breathing steady, but Michael knew it was only a matter of time before they would need to move again. The firelight flickered across the cave walls, casting long shadows that made everything seem surreal. Michael sat against the stone, his rifle resting across his lap, eyes scanning the entrance. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe. He kept thinking back to the battle that had brought him here. He had watched as Zarakala fought with a ferocity that left no room for mercy. She had been a force to be reckoned with, until she wasn't. Until she was lying there in the snow, broken and abandoned. It was strange to think that the same woman who had once been a threat to his people was now relying on him for survival. There was no denying that things had changed. Zarakala stirred, her eyes flickering open as she tried to push herself up. Michael was instantly on his feet, moving quickly to her side. Easy, take it slow, he said, his voice low and steady. Zarakala looked up at him, her eyes sharp but filled with exhaustion. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him as if trying to decide whether or not she could trust him. I'm not going anywhere, Michael reassured her, trying to offer some comfort. She blinked, processing his words. Then, slowly, she nodded and relaxed back against the cave wall. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice rough but tinged with curiosity. Michael hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the bond that was beginning to form between them. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to feelings. He wasn't sure what he felt, if anything, toward her. But something in him knew that leaving her behind wasn't an option. Because you're not my enemy anymore, he said quietly. Zarakala's gaze hardened for a moment, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked away, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Michael knew there was a lot she wasn't saying, but he wasn't about to push her. They both had their own demons to face. For now, all he could do was wait. The hours passed slowly. The fire began to die down, and the temperature inside the cave dropped again. Michael wrapped his coat tighter around him, trying to conserve body heat. He had always prided himself on his ability to endure, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for hers, too, and that thought unsettled him. He had never been one to trust easily, especially not after everything that had happened. But there was something about Zarakala that made him question his instincts. She wasn't like the other Zenthra soldiers he had fought against. She was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a vulnerability in her that made him want to protect her. It was absurd. She was a warrior, a leader of her people. She didn't need his protection. And yet, here he was, staying up all night to make sure she was okay. He glanced over at her again. She had fallen asleep. Her face relaxed for the first time since he had found her. The firelight danced across her features, casting a soft glow on her skin. She looked peaceful. It was hard to reconcile this version of Zarakala with the warrior he had seen in battle, but perhaps that was the point. She was more than just the role she had played in their war. She was someone with a story, a past, and a future. And for some reason, Michael had started to care. The thought made his stomach twist in an unfamiliar way. He didn't have time to dwell on it. The storm had stopped, but their journey was far from over. They needed to move soon, or they'd risk freezing before they made it to safety. Michael stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He had no idea where they were going or what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving her behind, no matter what. It was a promise he had made to himself when he first decided to save her, and it was one he intended to keep. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered weakly through the mouth of the cave. The storm had passed, but the sky remained a dull gray, the world still covered in snow. Michael had not slept much, but he couldn't bring himself to rest while Zarakala lay unconscious. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the reality of their situation began to set in. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. They needed to move, to find shelter, food, and perhaps even a way to signal for help. The thought of being trapped here for weeks, or worse, dying in this frozen wasteland, was something he refused to accept. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and checked his gear. The cold had drained most of the energy from his body, but the fire and his determination kept him going. The sound of Zarakala stirring brought his focus back to her. Her eyes were still closed, but she was shifting, her breathing coming in shallow bursts. He moved over to her side, crouching down to check on her. Her face was pale, but the color was returning to her skin, and the feverish heat had started to subside. She was still too weak to stand on her own, but at least she wasn't in immediate danger anymore. "You're awake," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Zarakala blinked slowly, her eyes slowly coming into focus. She was disoriented, but she managed a small nod. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke, but still steady. "I didn't expect to wake up," she murmured. Michael offered a small smile, though it felt strange on his lips. "Well, you're alive. That's more than we could have hoped for." She didn't respond right away, but her eyes studied him carefully. It was a long, uncomfortable silence, but Michael wasn't about to break it. He wasn't sure what to say to her. They were still strangers, despite the events that had unfolded between them. He wasn't even sure what he was feeling. He had never felt like this before. He was a soldier, and his job had always been to protect, to follow orders. But now, standing here with Zarakala, he felt something more than duty. He felt responsibility, but also something that was beginning to resemble friendship, maybe even something deeper. But that was a thought he wasn't ready to explore just yet. "We need to move," he said after a moment, his voice rough with the exhaustion he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. "Can you stand?" Zarakala hesitated, her expression unreadable, but then she nodded again, pushing herself up with a pained grunt. Michael moved quickly to steady her, his hands hovering near her waist, but he didn't touch her. She was proud, and she wouldn't appreciate his help if she didn't ask for it. Slowly, she found her footing, though it was clear the weight of her injuries had left her weaker than before. Her legs were wrapped in makeshift bandages, the skin still raw and tender from the injury. Michael tried not to stare. He knew she had been through hell to get here. "I can make it," she said, though her voice was strained. "We're not out of danger yet." Michael knew that. The wilderness around them was treacherous, and they couldn't afford to be out in the open for long. He adjusted his pack, making sure he had enough supplies to make it through the next few days. They would need to find shelter, food, and warmth, and quickly. "We'll go slowly," he said, his tone calm and steady. "One step at a time." Zarakala nodded, and together, they began the long, slow trek out of the cave. The snow crunched under their feet as they made their way into the bleak landscape. Michael kept his eyes on their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. His rifle was slung across his back, but he knew it wouldn't do much good if they were ambushed. The cold was the least of their worries. As they walked, Zarakala finally spoke again. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked, her voice still rough, but curious. Michael glanced over at her, his gaze softening. He hadn't expected the question, but it was one that had been lingering in the back of his mind for hours. "I couldn't," he said simply. "Leaving you there wouldn't have been right." There was a long pause as Zarakala absorbed his words. For the first time since they met, he saw something different in her eyes, something more than just the calculating warrior he had seen before. It was almost as if she were grateful. They walked in silence after that, the weight of their shared journey between them. The storm had passed, but the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. The wind had begun to pick up again as Michael and Zarakala made their way across the snow-covered landscape. Their footsteps left deep prints in the powdery white, but the storm was moving fast, and the once quiet world around them was beginning to feel more oppressive. The silence between them stretched, the only sounds the crunching of their feet in the snow and the distant howling of the wind. Zarakala moved slowly beside him, her every step calculated, her body clearly still recovering from the injuries she had sustained. Michael noticed the way she winced slightly with each movement, but she never once asked for help. There was a pride about her that reminded him of his own soldiers, a pride that came with being a warrior. They continued walking, neither of them speaking, but the weight of their shared experiences pressed on their shoulders. Michael glanced at Zarakala, the strong, proud alien warrior who had fought against his people just days ago. Now, she was his companion, and he was beginning to wonder just how different they really were. The bond between them had shifted, but he wasn't sure when it had happened. Had it been when he decided to help her? Or had it been earlier, when he chose to stay and fight beside her on the battlefield? He didn't know. All he knew was that the lines between them were becoming harder to define. Zarakala's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "You should rest," she said, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. "I can go on longer. You've done enough." Michael stopped in his tracks, turning to face her. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen when they first encountered each other. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. The cold was starting to get to him, too. They had been walking for hours, with no end in sight. He was starting to feel the fatigue settle into his bones. "We can rest when we find shelter," he added, his tone a little more weary than he intended. Zarakala studied him for a moment, her gaze intense, but then she nodded, and they kept moving forward. The journey felt endless, but eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, Michael spotted a break in the snow-covered terrain. It was a small, rocky outcrop, just big enough to provide some cover from the wind. He motioned for Zarakala to follow him, and they both moved toward it, their movements sluggish from exhaustion. When they reached the outcrop, Michael found a small depression in the rock where they could both sit. He immediately lowered himself to the ground, the weariness finally catching up to him. Zarakala sat next to him, her back against the rock, her eyes scanning the horizon as she always did, always alert, always ready. Michael leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. The cold still bit at his skin, but the shelter from the wind made it bearable. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionable, as if they had both come to understand the necessity of being still. After a few minutes, Zarakala spoke again, her voice quieter than usual. "Why did you stay?" she asked. Michael opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The question wasn't one he had expected, and he hesitated before answering. "Because you needed help," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, Michael saw something different in her eyes, something softer, less guarded. She said nothing, but the way she relaxed slightly told him she understood. They sat there for a while longer, the quiet between them no longer filled with tension, but with a shared understanding. Michael wasn't sure how long they would be stuck out here in the wilderness, or if they would even make it to safety. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Not with Zarakala beside him. Not with the weight of their journey ahead. He could hear the distant sound of wind, picking up again, but it didn't seem so harsh anymore. Together, they would face whatever came next. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly as they continued their journey through the wilderness. The cold had settled in deeper, the wind biting at their exposed skin and making every step feel like it took twice as much effort. Michael's boots crunched heavily in the snow, each step more labored than the last. He glanced over at Zarakala, who was moving alongside him with determination, though he could see the strain in her movements. She had been through so much, and yet, there she was, still walking beside him, unwilling to let herself falter. They had covered a good distance, but their situation had not improved. The small rock shelter had been a temporary refuge, but now they needed to keep moving, to find somewhere safer, somewhere that wasn't so exposed. Michael had no idea how much further they could go. His muscles were stiff, his body exhausted, but Zarakala needed him to keep going, and that was enough to push him forward. He couldn't let her down, not after everything. They came to a ridge, the wind howling as it whipped across the snow. The view was bleak, a never-ending sea of white stretching out before them, broken only by the occasional rock formation or sparse patch of frozen earth. Michael scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of shelter or even the faintest hint of movement. There was nothing. Just snow. Just cold. "We should keep moving," Michael said, his voice hoarse from the dry air. Zarakala nodded, though her eyes were focused on the ground beneath her. It was as if she was processing something, deciding what to say next. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "Why do you help me?" The question hit Michael harder than he expected. It wasn't the first time she had asked, but there was something different in her tone now, something softer, almost vulnerable. He turned to face her, his gaze meeting hers, but the words didn't come easily. Why did he help her? He had asked himself that same question many times, especially in the quiet moments between their travels. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, though even he wasn't sure if it was the whole truth. Zarakala didn't say anything for a long moment, but he could see the wheels turning in her mind. She had never been one for small talk or sentimentality, but something had shifted between them. They had both been through too much to pretend that they weren't connected in some way now. Finally, she spoke again. "I do not understand you," she said, her voice still heavy with confusion. "You could leave me. You could return to your people and forget about this. Why stay?" Michael took a deep breath, the chill of the air hitting his lungs like a sharp sting. He didn't have an answer ready. The truth was, he didn't know why he couldn't just walk away. But the thought of leaving her, of leaving anyone behind, was something that went against everything he had been taught. He was a soldier, but he was also human, and humans didn't leave people to die. He didn't leave people behind. "I don't leave anyone behind," he said simply, the words coming easier now, as if they were the only thing that made sense in the midst of all the confusion. Zarakala looked at him for a long moment, her golden eyes piercing through the cold, and for the first time, she looked thoughtful. She didn't respond, but the tension between them seemed to lessen, as if some unspoken understanding had been reached. As they moved forward, Michael could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him. They were far from safety, far from anything resembling a home. But in that moment, walking alongside Zarakala, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fleeting, but it was there, and it was enough to keep him going. As the day stretched on, they continued their trek through the frozen landscape, the wind howling in their ears, but somehow it didn't seem as cold anymore. Michael didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they would make it out alive or if they would be swallowed by the wilderness. But one thing was clear, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The terrain began to change as they moved further from the rocky outcrop. The snow, while still present, started to thin, revealing patches of bare ground covered in frost. The sky above had shifted from a dull gray to a pale blue, though the wind still bit at their skin. Michael glanced over at Zarakala, who was moving with a bit more confidence now, though her pace was still slower than normal. Her injuries were healing, but it was clear that she was still far from her full strength. Michael had kept watch over her the entire journey, making sure she had everything she needed, even though she hadn't asked for much. She was proud, a warrior at heart, and Michael respected that. But there were moments, like now, when he caught her glancing at him with something that resembled gratitude in her eyes. It was a small change, but it was there. Zarakala, the fierce warrior who had once stood as his enemy, was beginning to change in his eyes as well. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was someone who had been through pain and loss, just like him. And that realization made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: connection. They continued walking, their journey taking them further into the wilderness, the landscape becoming more desolate with every step. The wind howled again, and Michael pulled his jacket tighter around him, though he knew it wouldn't do much against the cold. His thoughts kept returning to what Zarakala had said the day before. "Why do you help me?" It was a question he couldn't answer easily. Why help someone who had been part of the force that had torn through his world? But here he was, walking side by side with her. He glanced at her again, wondering what had brought her to this point. What had she seen in her life? What had she lost? They had both been through wars. Both had seen their homes destroyed. But there was still so much they didn't know about each other. The thought lingered, but Michael pushed it aside. They needed to focus on getting through the next few days, on surviving. That was all that mattered. The world around them was unforgiving, and there was no time for distractions. We should find shelter before nightfall, Michael said, his voice breaking the silence. Zarakala nodded but didn't speak, her gaze still focused on the path ahead. As they walked, Michael couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her. She was becoming more human in his eyes, or perhaps he was starting to see her as more than just the enemy. He had heard stories about the Zinthara, about how they were ruthless, driven by an unyielding desire to conquer. But those stories never mentioned the quiet moments, the ones where soldiers like Zarakala had to fight not just for victory, but for survival. It was a side of war that Michael had learned to accept, but it was one he hadn't fully understood until now. Do you think we'll make it? Zarakala asked, her voice soft, almost as if the question had caught her by surprise. Michael paused for a moment, considering her words. It was the first time she had asked something like that, the first time she had shown any real doubt. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'll make sure we try. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissipate. Zarakala didn't speak again, but Michael could sense that she was taking in his words. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. As the day wore on, the cold began to grow more intense, and the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Michael knew they needed to find shelter soon. The harsh conditions of the wilderness weren't kind to anyone, especially not those who were already struggling. Finally, after what seemed like hours of walking, they found a small cave tucked into the side of a rock formation. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Michael motioned for Zarakala to follow him inside, and they both ducked into the cave, grateful for the temporary reprieve from the cold. Inside, it was still cold, but not nearly as harsh as outside. Michael set down his pack, looking around the small space. It was enough to keep them sheltered for the night. Zarakala settled down against the rock wall, her body clearly aching from the long journey. Michael sat across from her, resting his back against the cave wall. This will do for now, he said, his voice quieter than before. Zarakala didn't reply, but Michael could tell she appreciated the shelter. The cave wasn't much, but it was theirs for the moment. They had made it through another day, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, Michael woke to the sound of the wind howling outside the cave. He had managed to fall asleep for a few hours, but the cold still crept into his bones. The fire they had started the night before had long since gone out, and the cave was still frigid, but he was used to it by now. The journey had taken a toll on both of them, but they had made it through another night, and that was something. Zarakala was still asleep, her body curled into a tight ball for warmth. She looked different now, more fragile somehow, but the fierce warrior spirit that had defined her was still there. Michael watched her for a moment, wondering what she had been through in her life. He had never taken the time to ask before, but now he felt the urge to understand her better. They were no longer enemies. They were survivors, bound by the harsh conditions of the world around them. He shifted his weight and stood up, stretching his sore muscles. The ache in his body reminded him of just how far they still had to go. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot, but at least they had made it this far. It was enough for now. As he moved to check their supplies, he heard Zarakala stir behind him. Her voice was rough when she spoke, but there was a quiet strength in it. How long do you think we can keep going like this? She asked, her eyes still half closed. Michael turned to face her, his expression serious. As long as it takes, he replied. We'll find a way out of this. We have to. Zarakala sat up slowly, her movements cautious but purposeful. You don't have to keep protecting me, she said, her voice steady now. I'm not your responsibility. Michael shook his head, his gaze unwavering. You're not a burden. We're in this together. I'll get you out of here, no matter what. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, Michael saw the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. She had always been so guarded, so focused on survival, but now there was a crack in her armor. You're stubborn, Human, she said, her tone softer than usual. Michael smiled back, though it was a tired, weary smile. You're not so bad yourself, alien. They shared a brief moment of quiet understanding, two survivors who had come to rely on each other in ways they hadn't expected. The wind outside picked up again, and Michael knew it was time to keep moving. We need to find shelter, he said, grabbing his pack. And food. I don't think we'll last much longer if we don't. Zarakala nodded, standing up with some effort. She was still weak, but she was getting stronger, bit by bit. The harsh journey was taking its toll on both of them, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. They had each other, and that was a bond stronger than anything they had ever known before. Together, they stepped out of the cave, into the cold and unforgiving wilderness. The wind howled around them, but Michael didn't flinch. He kept moving forward, the weight of their survival pressing heavily on his shoulders. Zarakala walked beside him, her steps slower but steady. She was a warrior, and warriors didn't give up, no matter how hard the world around them tried to break them. Michael glanced at her, the thought of leaving her behind never even crossing his mind. They were in this together, and that was enough to keep him going, even when everything else seemed uncertain. As they moved through the snow, their journey was far from over, but in that moment, Michael felt a flicker of hope. They could do this. They had to. With every step, they were one step closer to survival, and that was a victory in itself.